Welcome to Power Lunch Live. It's good to be back on the air this week. We've got a fun conversation, one that I think is really, really important for entrepreneurs, for leaders, for business owners, and that's about following politics. And my guest today is an absolute expert in politics. We share a couple things. We share glasses and we share a beard, but we also share an absolute love of politics and how it impacts business. So we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to have a lot of fun in our conversation today. Of course, the whole point of Power Lunch Live is to bring today's thought leaders, best-selling authors, CEOs, people who are doing significant work, important work that can help us, that we can actually learn from and get better at what we do. So that's the whole point of the show. It's good to be with you here. So today's guest is Dr. Gavin Morrison. He's Director of Politics at Web Summit, Rise, and Collision. If you haven't been to one of those conferences, what are you thinking? Because that is where it is at. I tell you, I've met so many amazing people, contacts, and I'm doing business. It's actually a place where you go and you make deals and you do business. I just got back from Web Summit in Portugal, and already have several things happening because of that. Good relationships that are happening. And one of the people I met, I actually didn't meet it. I don't think I met it at Web Summit. I met at another conference in the UAE a couple of months later. But Dr. Gavin Morrison, he is the head of, like I said, the director of politics at Web Summit, Rise, and Collision. Gavin, welcome, man.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So, sort of along the topic, what is your role at Web Summit and at Collision and Rise, and why does a tech conference need somebody that's focused on the politics? What is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my role with all of our events is to curate all of the sort of social, political, economic content that we would position on our stages there. So my role is really to work with politicians, academics, journalists, etc., NGOs, social figures, to bring them along, work with them to figure out what they're going to say, how they're going to say it, and run that kind of political show on the day. So as part of that, I'm always grappling with, what are the big political and social issues impacting tech businesses at the minute? What are the themes, the topics, the problems that we need to be covering on stage? How do we cover them? And how do we get the right people to come and to talk about them? It's a lot of fun. I enjoy it. I think, you asked there as well, why does a tech company need to have someone focused on politics? I think at any tech company that doesn't have at least someone thinking about these political problems is going to run into big problems of their own. I think you look at the way in which regulation is coming down the line or has come in various areas. Give an example, the GDPR, for example, surrounding data in Europe has completely changed how a lot of businesses function across the entire European continent. I think you look at some of the, for example, revelations that Web Summit speaker Frances Haugen brought to light in October, I think makes it increasingly clear that the big social media companies are going to face increased regulation. I think you look at things as well, like the appointment of Lena Khan to the FTC makes it increasingly likely that There's going to be some sort of antitrust action against some of the big tech companies in the US. And I think something that went under the radar a bit, another Web Summit speaker, Meredith Whitaker, was recently appointed as a senior advisor to Lena Khan on AI and tech issues. So I think, the US government is taking much more of an interest in what's going on with tech. The European Union has produced legislation in the past and is bringing more. The Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act are both coming. You go outside the US and the EU, China is starting to regulate certain parts of the tech sector. I was reading today, the Chinese government is cracking down on AI and deep fake technology, and you look at
Mhm.
what they're doing around crypto mining and things like that. So, I think wherever you look, whatever markets you're trying to have your company operate in to function in, regulation and policy are changing or have changed how your company functions, what you can do, and what you should be doing. And so, we want Web Summit to be, and Collision and Rise, we want all of our events to be the events that you come to, where if you're not sure about some of these policy issues, about some of these politics issues, that you come to our events and you can learn about them. You'll hear about them. You'll meet the policymakers. You'll meet the people that are at the cutting edge of research on all of these issues and learn about it. And hopefully more and more tech companies, startups, as well as some of the bigger companies will take politics and policy seriously, and really start to try and grapple with some of these issues.
So thanks for that. I think that's a great answer. What for you? So in your view, are some of the top issues right now? So let's just say you're a startup tech company, right? In Texas, or you're a small startup company in Ireland. Are you facing similar challenges, similar regulations, similar? What are the issues you think you're going to face?
Yeah. So I think some of the big issues that you're gonna face, particularly I'd say for the number one, is around data protection and privacy. So if you're a tech startup, you're almost definitely going to be dealing with data in some way. Whether that be gathering data, what you're using it for predictive analytics. If you're in AI, you need data to build your AI systems, and various other uses for data. I think you look at the EU and US frameworks; they're quite different. The EU obviously has the GDPR there; it's been there for a good number of years. And actually, I think one of the biggest challenges you sort of asking, is there a challenge for that's different for EU, Europe, and US? And yes,
Yeah.
the challenges are different, but actually one of the biggest challenges at the minute is if you want to operate in both. So if you're
Ah,
a startup that you want
that's
and you want
great.
to and you want to operate on a sort of a global scale, which I think most, we think of tech as being borderless, um, but you look at trying to operate between the US and EU since the Schrems 2 case in the CJEU struck down the US EU privacy shield. It's now very difficult to transfer data between the US and the EU. So without larger infrastructure, it can be quite hard for a startup to operate in both jurisdictions. You kind of have to pick one. So
Can
if
you
you're
can you explain that? What is the difference? I mean, what is the get a little bit into depth into what that means into the
Yeah,
law?
so basically, the Privacy Shield agreement was an agreement between the US and EU to allow for data transfers between the two jurisdictions, that basically said that the US's data protection regulations were good enough for the EU to be happy with it. That was challenged in court by an activist called Max Schrems, and it was ultimately struck down by the top court in Europe, which basically means that you can still transfer data between the two, but it's much more difficult. You essentially have to go through a lot more hoops to show that your data gathering in the US has sufficient safeguards and privacy protections in place if you want to bring that data into the EU, or if you're
Okay.
accessing European data in the US, you again have to show that you have much stronger privacy and data protection regulations than you would normally need to have in the US. So if you're a US company and you say start up in Texas, you might start off working in the US market. You'll have certain data protection practices in place. You then want to take your company global and you go to operate in Europe. You'll actually find it could be quite difficult because of the current mismatch between the regulations in the two jurisdictions and the fact that the European regulations are stricter. There are some moves in the US to try and catch up a bit with the EU. There's, for example, in California, there's the Consumer Protection Act, and I think came into force last year, that somewhat emulates the GDPR to an extent, but without a sort of an EU-US deal in place. As I say, it could be quite difficult for any startups trying to operate in both jurisdictions.
Yeah, wow. So how do all right? So in the conferences, in these global conferences that you guys put on, are you looking for, I don't want to say controversy, but are you looking for varying opinions on this? Are you looking for debate? Are you looking for I don't want to say conflict, but again, it's healthy discussion. Is that what you're looking for in these?
Absolutely. I think if I went to a conference and everyone sat around agreeing with each other, I'd get very bored very quickly. But I think also, we want to be, with Web Summit Collision, with all of our events, we want to be an event where our attendees come to get challenged, get pushed in their views. It's one of my favorite philosophers is John Stuart Mill, and there's a great bit in On Liberty when he's talking about sort of freedom of speech.
Right.
And one of the justifications he gives for it is if we suppress things that we think are wrong, then we sort of forget how to make our own arguments. So even I regularly invite speakers to come and speak at our events that I disagree with, and I always want them there more than the speakers that I agree with, because I want to have my views pushed and challenged, and I want our attendees to have their views pushed, challenged, tested, and we want that to happen on stage as well. We want speakers to be on stage pushing each other, disagreeing politely. I don't. We don't want anybody to go out on stage and be actually offended, but we do want their views to be challenged. And when it comes to politics, that's always good fun. Those sorts of debates are always they can get quite spicy. I remember a couple of years ago, I think 2019 Web Summit, we had two speakers, Joe Pounder and Neil Katyal. Joe is a sort of a Republican political consultant, and he works in kind of political marketing, that sort of thing.
Right.
Neil is a former acting Solicitor General of the United States. He was in the Obama administration. They, to put it gently, disagree with each other a little bit.
Tiny bit.
A tiny bit. So we popped two podiums up on stage, and we got a journalist to sit in the middle and moderate it, and said, have a debate, about the state of US politics, about what's going on. And the two of them, they went at it. They had a lot of fun. They really, really pushed each other. And that's the sort of thing that I think you don't get at a lot of events. And it's something that we, at Web Summit and at Collision, we really consciously try to do. We try to put together sessions and discussions that will challenge themselves within themselves, and will then challenge our attendees as well, push them to think a little bit outside the box, to think about things they've not thought about before, and to think about them in a way that they've not thought about them before.
So, if you switch gears a little bit, if you're a small business owner or startup, or where should you be looking for? I mean, let's just say you can't come to Collision, you can't come to the big conferences. Where should you be looking for good information? Like, what do you read? What do you trust? What what news sources do you trust for really good business information?
That's an interesting question. I read a lot. Part of my job is to stay in front of a lot of these issues. So I'll name a few outlets that I think the one thing I would say is that's key is variety. Um, for me
Mhm.
anyway, I think it'd be important for anyone if you're just reading the same sort of couple of views and opinions and just listening to the same couple of views and opinions all the time, then you're only going to get that one side of the argument or one side of the story. So I think key would be to try and get a bit of variety. But some outlets that I'm a particular fan of personally, I regularly read, for example, the MIT Technology Review. I think if you're looking for some real deep dives into issues affecting tech and how tech affects society, it's great. And it brings very often sort of almost a more academic view on things. I think some of the obvious big print publications, the likes of the New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC is always they're always thereabouts. And I think as well, it's good to get onto things like Substack and start looking for some of those more independent voices. Something that I really enjoy is done by Yasha Monk is Persuasion. It's an email sort of newsletter and website that again brings sort of more academic voices and tries deliberately to get different opinions and different views mixed in there. So I think there's a lot more that as I say, I read a lot. Places like Politico is great, The Hill, in
Mhm.
particular US politics. I could go on and on.
So, any good books that people should read to sort of look at the landscape of tech and where are any good books you recommend?
Probably a few. There's an academic, Virginia Eubanks. I'm trying to remember the exact title of her book, but it's essentially about the impact of algorithms on economic inequality in the US. And I would very much recommend that. There's another academic, Safia Noble, at UCLA. Again, similarly, I think her book's called, Algorithms of Oppression. And it's a great one to read again, similarly about how algorithms are playing into perpetuating racism. And so she's really trying to take that on. Another one, and this is by another academic based in the UK, Carissa Veliz. Um, she was going to speak at Web Summit, but she unfortunately wasn't able to make it this year. She hopefully will be there in November 2022, and it's called Privacy is Power. And it's what I was saying there about data protection, privacy. I think it's going to be one of the biggest issues of the next 10 years, and she's really at the kind of cutting edge of academic research on how to try and tackle the problems that privacy and data protection bring us. And it's a great, very readable book. Um, that's three. Again, there's probably more, and I'm probably forgetting some great ones, but yeah.
Well, no, that's all right. Yeah, sorry. So, sorry to skip around. All these questions just sort of pop into my head at random times, so I apologize. But I wanted to go back a second because I got a question from on LinkedIn a little bit ago, and wanted to ask you this question. And the question is there anywhere to go? And they asked, is there anywhere to go to sort of look at? Albert asked, anywhere to go to look at sort of the future state of politics, I think is what he was asking. And I don't really quite understand that, Albert. But and I guess maybe what you were just talking about with the news and the books, and it's just sort of that'll help you give you a view of what's going to happen. So I guess, Albert, that's how I would answer that question. Do you have any other suggestions, Gavin, from how we can kind of get a future look at what's going to happen or what's happening?
With it's a tough one. Politics, you're trying to predict what's going to happen in
Yeah.
politics is arguably a bit of a fool's game. It almost always something happens to make your predictions come wrong. I think when it comes to trying to predict the future and looking at the future of politics, I would say the sort of news outlets, books. I would say you could watch things like some of the documentaries that have been coming out. For example, the Center for Humane Tech, Chris on Harris, they had that documentary on Netflix again about the sort of privacy and data aspects of things. So trying to watch some of that longer, maybe sort of longer form material that's out there can help maybe give a bit more of an insight. And then actually also probably podcasts and sort of shows like this one, like your own, for US politics, there's a guy, Brian Tyler Cohen. If you want to know what's going to happen in sort of particularly democratic politics in the US, his podcast is a great place to go. And at Web Summit and Collision as well. He's a repeat speaker of ours. So there's a lot of places I think to get information. It's the tricky bit then is if you're trying to look to the future is taking that information and making a prediction. I have a PhD in political science, and I would not be willing to put my neck out and make too many predictions. And I know a lot of doctors of politics who would be similar. So it's unfortunately, I think if you want to see the future, you just gotta wait.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for that. Thanks for the question, Albert. The other question that I had that I got over online here was, Gavin, do you believe that government is going to make it more and more difficult for businesses to operate with overregulation?
So I hope not. I think the tech sector needs to be regulated. I think for a very long time now, the tech sector has operated largely unregulated. Obviously, as I mentioned, GDPR, a few other bits and pieces. There's some regulation out there, but it's been a largely fairly light touch. And I think you look at again what's happened, particularly around some of the social media, the large social media platforms. Again, as Francis revealed in October, it's clear that there are a lot of problems with how tech is operating. I think if you go and read some of the work of someone like Shoshana Zuboff with surveillance capitalism, you'll get a little bit terrified of how some of these companies operate. So I think regulation is coming. I, I'm not too worried at the minute about over regulation, um, given the fact that we're starting from a fairly blank slate. My concern would more be with the wrong regulation. Um, and I think you look at GDPR as an example. I think it has made it more difficult for small companies to operate, small companies in particular, and that was an unintended consequence of that regulation. It's something I think the European Union probably needs to look at how to try and fix that. Um, I think if you bringing in sort of these blunter sort of regulatory instruments can be very problematic. And I also think if we look at regulation in sort of silos, if we start trying to say, okay, well, we're going to do antitrust and that's all we're going to do, then that's we'll just end up right back where we started. If we say, okay, we're going to bring in data privacy regulations that basically just mean everyone has to click those really annoying cookie acceptance boxes every time they go on a website, that's not really doing the job. So, I think there's a lot of ways in which governments can and probably will regulate tech. I think some of the time they're going, government being government, they're going to get it pretty wrong, and that's going to cause problems for a lot of companies. But hopefully, and I am hopeful of this. I think, as I mentioned earlier, particularly in the US, some of the right moves are being taken with the likes of Lee McCann and Tim Wu being involved in the Biden administration. Some of the legislation, particularly around antitrust, coming out of the Senate under like Amy Klobuchar and David Cicilline in the House. I think there's positive steps being taken. So I'm hopeful that we'll get good legislation that allows businesses to operate, but doesn't have a sort of wild west that we've had over the last 10, 15 years. Um, and I think in the EU as well, the DSA and the DMA look like they should be reasonably sensible pieces of legislation that hopefully will have a positive impact.
Eugene, thank you for the question. I've got a couple more questions that have come in. Do you mind taking these?
Huh? Yeah.
Good. I didn't know if we were going to have any today, so I didn't prep you that we were going to take live audience questions. But these are pretty good. And Liza asked us if Gavin is. Do you think that the antitrust, talking about what you were just speaking about, do you believe that the antitrust is a good antitrust movements against the likes of Facebook and some of the other big social media companies? Is that wise, or is that smart for the government to do?
So I think with antitrust, it's a tricky one, because a lot of these companies do have very large market share, and actually antitrust, it's one of those funny bits of sort of regulation where again the US and EU look at things completely differently. So in the US, the focus of antitrust is always on, are you doing harm to the consumer? So the classic example with the railroads back in the Gilded Age, they drove up the prices, and so they were doing harm to the consumer, so they got broken up. The question then, so in the US, is, are these companies doing harm to the consumer? And there's a lot of different ways I think that you can do antitrust. So I think, for example, there was a letter sent to the FTC there, I think just recently, about app platforms, and particularly the Google, the Play Store and the App Store, and the fees that they charge to apps, and the sort of closed shop that they operate. So I think you can take antitrust regulation there that's not necessarily breaking up companies. So you're not necessarily breaking the Play Store away from Google or the App Store away from Apple. But what you're doing is you're saying, no, you can't do what you're doing anymore. You have to open these marketplaces up and operate in a fairer way. Then I think so that's one place where you could look at antitrust. Actually, that probably is a good thing if that brings down the cost for apps to get to market. That increases competition, that increases consumer choice. I think that has a positive effect, and I think doing something like that will happen, hopefully. And I think again, in the US framework, will work quite well. I think you take the Facebook example. I've heard a lot of people talk about should we break up Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram from each other. I think it's looking increasingly likely that the US is trying to go that way. Whether that's actually going to fix the problems is hard to say. All three of those companies are data hungry companies. They make their money from gathering data,
Right.
and I don't think breaking them up is necessarily going to fix that problem. So it's I'm not sure if what the right answer is. I think with Facebook and with these other social media platforms, I think we need to look at the data gathering practices. I think we need to look at the business model, and how they monetize the gathering of data. That might involve needing to break some of the pieces apart. And there are certainly people who know much more about that than I do.
What's the difference? Because you started to talk about a little bit about the difference between sort of the U.S. take on that and European take on that.
Yes.
How do the regulators look at that differently?
So as I mentioned, the US focuses on do these practices harm the consumer? The EU legal framework for antitrust essentially looks at it by saying, does this diminish competition within this industry sector? So it doesn't look at the harm to the consumer, but it looks at can small companies compete? That's why actually in some ways antitrust legislation is probably, or action is probably, more likely in the EU at the minute maybe than the US, despite those positive steps that I mentioned, that the Biden administration, Lena Khan, Tim Wu, and others getting involved in that administration. They're big antitrust proponents. They're probably two of the world's leading experts on US antitrust. The EU is probably more likely to take some form of antitrust action against big tech companies because of the sort of command of the market share that something like Facebook has. When you look at combine Facebook and Instagram, the sort of market share of social media and particularly
Yeah.
social media advertising that they have across Europe, the EU is much more likely to say, actually, you're diminishing competition. We're going to have to separate you.
Yeah.
Um, so it's kind of easier for them to take that sort of action, and
Right.
probably harder for them to take the same sort of action that the US is looking likely to take around the app stores that I
Mhm.
mentioned, because there is competition there. There's more than one app store. There's competition between them. There's competition between the apps. So it's maybe harder for the EU to take action in that direction.
Well, thank you for answering that, and thanks, Lisa, for the question. We got more of a comment from Mitchell. Mitchell just says, um, sounds like he's saying it's critical responsibility of founders and directors to pay attention to politics. I think we would all agree. We've kind of made that case today that there's so much going on that you really have to sort of be in tune with what's happening in your industry. Um, and it's probably good. I know we didn't really talk about this, but it's probably good to have sort of multiple views and multiple people
Mhm.
in your business that where you can sort of find the middle ground, right, and
Yeah.
have good, healthy debate, even internally. I think
Yeah. And
sometimes.
I think actually something I didn't mention. There's probably two strands as well to why you should pay attention to politics. One is it's important for your company and for your company to do well. But there's also, I think you see increasingly with the business roundtable saying, actually, companies have to deliver not just to their shareholders, but to societal stakeholders. So if you're not paying attention to politics, I used to lecture politics in Trinity College, and one of the things I used to teach my students was that politics is the art of how we figure out how to live together, despite the fact we disagree. We're all going to disagree. How do we have a society in the face of that? So if you're not paying attention to politics, you're not paying attention to how we live together. And if you're not doing that, then you're failing essentially as a citizen. So I think there's almost a moral obligation, I think, for founders to pay attention to politics, as well as a strong business case for them to do it.
That begs another question when you said that, because I think that is just so totally true. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot the last couple of years is we've had, I mean, let's face it, society is horribly split on politics, right? And we've lost the art of debate or civil debate, right?
Mm.
We've lost the art of I mean, I think one of the things that makes good public policy, right, is you having strong political parties that can debate the issues in a healthy way, right? You can have a robust discussion and you can have political differences, but good public policy is when you meet in the middle. How does a company, and I think this is something that leaders have to face and have to acknowledge, is that half your workforce is over here and the other half of your workforce is probably over here. And so how do we get these teams to start talking and working together? Because there is a uptick. From my understanding, I was reading something the other day where HR directors are saying it's very, very common now. More and more people come into their offices and say, I can't work with this person because they believe this or they think this,
Mm.
and I'm not going to work with that person.
Yeah.
And so it's increasingly that companies are having to deal with this sort of societal divide that we have. What's your recommendation for a leader on how to deal with that?
It's a really, really tough question. I think we were actually talking about this in December when we met in the UAE, that we've
Yeah,
lost, you said, kind of the ability to disagree with each other.
yeah,
And it's such an important thing that we are able to disagree. Even set aside kind of politics. If we're going to disagree about smaller, more trivial things. We're going to disagree about how to do a particular task in our company. We've got to know how to have a conversation with each other in which we disagree and do it respectfully. I'm actually, I just finished recently reading it took me longer to get to reading this book than I'd like, but by John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, the Coddling of the American Mind. And they have some great insights into sort of the generational differences in how the generation that have kind of grown up online, Gen Z, sort of the one younger than me. I'd be a millennial. Millennials and Gen X and boomers all took to kind of doing things. And one of the arguments he makes is that in some ways Gen Z is arguably sort of more fragile in how they kind of look at the world. And so it becomes harder for them to maybe disagree with people. Sometimes I think maybe it's too generally about generations. I think, part of the problem, I think, stems from the way in which we engage online. You look at something like Twitter, and initially we had 140 characters, now 280 characters, and it lends itself towards a lack of nuance, a lack of engagement. It's, oh, I think this, well, I think you think that, therefore I think you're a terrible person, get out of my life, you're blocked. As opposed to sitting down and having a nuanced, long form, detailed discussion. And actually, I think anytime someone disagrees with someone, the best way to figure it out is to sit down with each other and to talk about why you think what you think. Why do you hold the opinion that you hold, and why do I hold the opinion that I hold? And if we can start trying to understand the why of each other's opinions a bit more, and not just the what, then we can start trying to figure out, okay, well, actually, if the reasons for why I hold my opinion aren't good, I need to change that. And that also then plays into all sorts of problems with our sort of the way in which we just as humans, we think about things. If an opinion we hold is central to our own view of ourselves, having that challenged causes us to react almost violently. It sort of triggers this sort of cognitive response that can be very, very difficult. So particularly if the view that is being questioned is something that you hold as really core to your central view of who you are, then challenging that causes more problems. So you need to, my advice to HR managers is tread softly, but try to increase the modes and ways in which employees can sit down both formally and informally and have conversations with each other about difficult topics. And I think the last thing I would say on that is don't be afraid of difficult topics. I think too often we sort of think, oh, we can't talk about that. One of the things I love about working in Web Summit is, the team I'm on, we work on producing the stage content at all of our stages. A big part of that is we have to be, as I've mentioned, sort of right at the cutting edge of where everything is at. And so we're constantly sitting down, formally and informally, and talking about things. And, we have some barnstorming disagreements. And it's a lot of fun, but at the end of the day, we always respect each other. We respect the other person, and we're able to disagree. We're able to have those debates and those discussions, and have fun with them. And then that helps us then as well put together, I think, better content. We as a result have a better understanding of the different arguments and viewpoints that we're going to put on stage at our events, because we have really strong internal team culture that allows for that disagreement. And part of that comes from not being afraid to talk about those difficult issues. We sit down in a room together, 15, 16 of us, and we talk about them, and we have different views and opinions. And then we walk out of that room and, we go down to the local pub and we have a pint. And it's, I think that's kind of the advice that I would give.
So I thank you, and I appreciate that. And I had one other. I'm going to take one more question from Allie, because I think it's a good follow up to what you were just talking about. I just came in, and she asked, "Is this something that?" It's a long question. So okay, so she says, essentially, let me summarize it. So do you recommend that leaders sort of proactively introduce these topics with their teams? So should leaders sit down with their teams and talk about these divisive social issues to put them out on the table before there's a problem, or do you think that this is addressing it when it becomes an issue is the right way?
Yeah, that's also a tricky one. I think in some ways, I mentioned kind of the team that I'm on here in Web Summit, and it's
right.
Our
Which is a
job
unique
is
team. It's a unique
it's
team,
almost a
right?
unique team. Our job is to talk about these issues, so we have to kind of do it on a regular basis. So we figured out as our own team a good way of doing that, and we essentially just meet regularly and talk about them. What I would say is, I think for company leaders is probably you want to make sure that you're aware of the different issues and topics and views that are there. I think on certain things, you certainly want to be proactive and you want to be out there and getting in front of things. So I think, on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, you've got to be out there, you've got to be tackling them. I think, they're big focuses for us at Web Summit.
Yeah.
We're always trying to have more diverse voices on our stages. And that's across all spectrums from gender, race, ethnicity, everything. We want it to be people saying different things and different people saying different things. We don't want everyone on our stages to look or sound the same. But I think as well, within then your own company hiring policies, you've got to be aware of the issues that are there, and you've got to be sensitive to them. I think people make mistakes. I think a great example of people making mistakes this week, Whoopi Goldberg. What she said on The View was wrong.
Yeah.
And but has The View have they reacted correctly to that? There's arguments to be made there. I think people make mistakes. Be aware of the fact that you're probably going to make mistakes, and be ready to apologize. And it's got to be a real apology when you make a mistake, and B, fix it. Never make the same mistake twice. In terms of then actually internally within your company talking about these issues and maybe some of the other divisive issues like politics, I would say probably not. Don't bring it up directly yourself. I'd say try and make it a space in which people can talk about these issues. Some people will be more comfortable than others talking about them. So having, I think, those informal spaces where employees can talk, can relax, and can be honest with each other is important. I think obviously you do have to have policies in your company as well around there are certain things that simply aren't acceptable.
Right.
And you've got, it's not acceptable to be racist. You've got to have policies against that and take action when it happens. But having space for people to debate and discuss divisive and difficult issues is, I think, important.
Yeah, I agree, Mitchell. Mitchell, we'll get to your question, or you can actually work with me offline on that. I'll certainly answer that question offline. But thank you for your comments, and thank you, Ali, for that question. Hey, man, I could talk about this stuff all day. You every time you speak, you brings up a whole nother range of questions, and I wanted to ask you, Gavin, about sort of these big social movements, right? Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and actually, because it politics is at the center of those, and I think, what's your take on how companies respond to those issues and the speed at which they respond, and then really how in sync do they have to be with their policies and what they say publicly? Because I think you've got, and is that one of the reasons why we see the great resignation right now, where people are just leaving the corporate world in droves by the millions, at least in the United States? Is that all what that is? That a result of a lot of that, where the employees aren't seeing the ethics and I guess they're not seeing the companies live up to what they stand for? Is that why people are leaving?
I mean, I think that's a complicated question, and I think there's a complicated answer there. I think absolutely that's going to play into it. I think I'm not going to name any names, but I think there were certainly a lot of companies who, were very good at paying a lot of lip service and haven't necessarily taken concrete steps, concrete action to actually try and tackle some of the problems. The the tech sector is still, to use a bit of a cliche, still worryingly pale, male, and steel. I'm almost very aware that it's two white men talking about it, but it is very pale, male, and steel, and that's a problem. And it's a problem that in the past people have talked about, fixing pipelines, fixing recruitment problems, fixing various other things,
funding for women businesses,
funding for women,
yeah.
all these things, but. And too often, I think companies think, oh, if we just kind of do a thing, it'll be fine. But it's actually tackling these problems goes way beyond just, sending a recruiter to a historically black college or university once a year. It goes way beyond just sort of, maybe saying, okay, we're going to, try and make sure that women are paid equally to men in our company. All those things are things that companies should do. They're good things to do. But too often, I think companies look at it and go, okay, we're going to have our policy and that's going to be the one thing we do. When actually broader sweeping change needs to happen. We need to completely look at, recruitment policy. If you're talking about sort of diversity, equity, inclusion in recruitment, why aren't there more diverse faces there? I think you look at the US, a big part of that as well is going to tie into some of the labor laws and labor protections that you have there. The US is, I believe, the only developed country in the world with 0 hours of federally mandated maternity leave. I think, certainly across most of Europe, you're looking at least 20 weeks of maternity leave there. So if you're a woman and you're looking to get into the workforce in the US, that's a major barrier. Or if you're a man, or whoever you might be, that can be a major barrier to workforce entry and to your progression, because companies are not required to respect life choices that are important to people. So I think bringing it back almost to politics, I think and companies can get out in front of this. Companies can implement their own policies and get out in front of government policy. But I think things like bringing in maternity leave, bringing in better pay. I think as well, you look at something we haven't really talked about, the gig economy. I think you look at a lot of tech workers, people working in the gig economy, and they are exploited. And they don't have the labor protections and rights that they need and deserve. And I think that again goes to a broader societal issue and discussion than just how are we recruiting or what are we doing?
No, you're right. I mean, that's a whole show in itself, because that is, as we become more global and we become more remote, right? I mean, a lot of companies that you talk to are saying, well, I can't hire in the US anymore because of this and that. And I'll go to Argentina and hire. I'll go to Ecuador and hire. I'll go to Brazil and hire. I'll go to Europe and hire, Eastern Europe or something. And they're not paying the same to an engineer in Eastern Europe that they're paying in Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a question. I mean, there are a lot of questions around that, absolutely. And there's just so much to talk about, man. We could talk about this for hours, but we're reaching almost that hour point now, and so we'll end it there. But Gavin, man, this is we should do this on a more regular basis, because I think there's a hunger for it, just based on the questions we got today, and they're still coming in. So thank you for everybody that asked today and made comments in the feed. So appreciate that.
But if anyone wants to get in touch with me, feel free. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. Come find me. Happy to chat. And yeah, Rhett, absolutely love doing this. Love to do it again.
Yeah, there's just so much to this, and there's so much to pay attention to, right? And maybe we can have a panel next time. Maybe we can bring in a little healthy debate.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm always game.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here on Power Lunch today. Next week we are off. I'm going to be in Turkey at a conference. So we'll not be on air next week, but I appreciate you for being here today. And until the week after next, stay safe, stay healthy, have a great week, and see you next time.